So hi everyone, my name is Alice Barber, and I'm here in two roles, I think. Well, maybe three, actually. So the first and most important is that I am a mom to a 10-year-old named Jess, who came out as trans in first grade and now is a rising fifth grader and is identifying as non-binary, and is using she, her, they, them pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I identify as queer. Am married to Bonnie, Jess's other mom. And the other two hats, one is that I'm a therapist for children. So my specialty really are kids ages 2 to 12, and with a specialty in early childhood trauma. And so I do work with kids who run the gamut on, all sorts of spectrums. And the last is that, I am a middle-aged queer person and grew up in a time and came out in a time that is not like it is now. So, and that has informed both my and my wife's sort of understanding of our own child and our fears and our all sorts of emotions that we have about our child's own journey. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you.
And hi, my name is Romina Pacheco. I use she, her pronouns. I am here mainly in the role of parent. I have two children, one 2-year-old and an 11-year-old who is going into the 6th grade. I'm also an educator. That's what I do as a profession, who focuses mostly on social justice education. And that's
Awesome.
what I'm here to offer. I should say, in all fairness and for transparency, I identify as heterosexual, and I am married to a cisgender straight man, who is the father of my 2 children.
Nice to meet you both. Oh, sorry, Davey, you were saying something.
No, go ahead.
Do you have any questions about the project before we start?
Not that I can think of.
No, you did a good job explaining it. So now I'm really looking forward to watching the videos.
Thank you. It may be a while, but I will definitely send them out. All right, so the first couple questions that I wanted to ask you both are pretty broad. The first one being, what do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
I think that honestly, they need what all young people need, in my opinion, which is acceptance and understanding. To me, that's what it comes down to. So whatever the community, like the family, the schools, the neighborhood, wherever the people that they interact with on a regular basis need to do to make that happen, needs to happen in order to live in a space where they feel understood and accepted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think I would add that they need folks who are in roles and positions of a lot of privilege, for whatever reason, to remember that we are human beings. It sounds really basic, right? But that we're human beings with feelings and the same desires and wants and needs as everybody else, and that there's there's so much effort that folks go into to make people other in whatever ways that they do, right? Whether it's race or gender identity or like whatever part of somebody's identity they happen to target. And so, and yet our feelings and our experiences aren't other, right? They're the same as, like I've often said, we're real, we're just a boring little family, right? We want the same as everybody else. And so to label us as other somehow sometimes doesn't make sense to me. So just to know that these kids want to be loved, they want to be, to what Romina said, they want to be loved, they want to be cared for, they want cool clothes and friends and TV and video games, and they want to go to school, and they, without feeling like they're hated or that they're in trouble or that they're not safe.
Thank you.
I and if I could add, everything you said, Alice, resonated, and I agree with, of course. Something that I've run into, recently, it's also with my own child, the older one particularly. It's also respect. That's the word I'm looking for. Respect feelings, emotions, and identities, right? No, what my child in particular, I'm going to speak about that. Something that she's been very clear about is for us as adults not to impose our views and to take her full range of emotions and thoughts and ways of identifying as real and clear and valid, right? So, and what I mean by that is by not making statements like, oh, this is just a stage. You're only saying that because you're a kid. You haven't been on this earth for that long. So you don't, you're only saying that because you don't really know. And that's something that for sure young people in general, and certainly queer youth don't need to hear, that it's so disregarding their feelings and experiences or minimizing it, right? So I think that's something that many adults need to learn how to bite our tongues and listen more and be respectful of what they're saying and feeling and expressing in the moment.
If I could piggyback on that, that was really well said, and it's something that I really strongly believe in, both professionally and as a parent. That oftentimes what I hear is, "Oh, this child's only 6, and so they don't really know themselves." Right. And, and I don't know. I mean, I believe that 6-year-olds know themselves the best of all as 6-year-olds, the same way I know myself the best of all as a 49-year-old. And I might not know who I might be at 75, but neither does anybody else. And so, and sometimes parenting feels like a series of events in which parents have to again and again and again come to terms with the fact that their child or their children has a different story than we do as parents, right? That when I was about to give birth to Jess, there was so much unsolicited advice, right? That you get when you're about to have a child. But the best one, and I can't for the life of me remember who said this, but I was writing out a birth plan because it was something that somebody said that I had to do. So like, how did I want this to go? So I was writing out things about how I wanted the birth to go. And somebody said, "Oh, no. You don't get to decide that. Like this is your child's book that's beginning to open, and it's their story. And this isn't your book anymore, Alice. Like, you don't get to decide how the birth is going to go. You don't get to decide how infancy is going to go. I mean, you can control certain things, but you don't. This is a human being. And so Romina, I feel really strongly about what you said, that we often dismiss kids as being too young to know who they are. And yet I don't know who they are yet, right? Like, they know who they are.
Yeah, thank you so much. So another question I had is, what do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
So much, right? And I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but just like any other, and not to flatten or minimize, right? But, just like any other young people, what they bring, right, in their fullness, specifically to queer trans youth that I have observed, it's also, it's sense of curiosity and openness, and for me, particularly thinking as a straight person, right, living in a very heteronormative world, it's also bringing openness and like the pushing of the boundaries and the envelope, in a way that I see as positive because it's transformative, right? Like when I hear my child or other, queer trans student children and young people, like asking to be accepted, for instance, or perhaps changing language. Like there's so much that I've been learning, even though I do this for a living as a social justice educator, there's so much that I'm learning from my 11-year-old about new terminology, that it's in place now, or new ways of identifying that I, obviously, what I studied formally in school years ago, it doesn't quite fit anymore. So I think that this is one of the beautiful things that, from looking at it from an asset perspective, that young queer and trans people bring, that it encourages us, right, to change and to move and not to get stuck in one point in time.
I've learned so much about my own gender identity from queer youth, that they are sort of really busting open the world of what my generation and generations that are older than me have thought that the world was, and that we made a lot of assumptions, and they're just busting open those assumptions. And thank goodness, right? Like, we don't want things to stop. We want things to keep moving. And this generation of kids is so, these queer trans kids in general, and everyone's different, right? So generalizing feels funny to me, but they are really sort of, as a collective, thinking really deeply about who they are and where they fit in the world. And in doing that, they think they challenge the rest of us to do the same if we are open to doing that. And it's just a depth of thought that I don't, for instance, as a rising fifth grader, so my child is a rising fifth grader, right? I don't remember thinking that broadly or deeply when I was a rising fifth grader. I mean, when I think about what was important to me, it was getting good grades, and I watched Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch and things like. I don't remember thinking about my identity that deeply and in such a profound way. And there wasn't the language for it then, and there weren't the role models, and they weren't, I didn't experience a lot of I just didn't experience anything. It was like there was nothing there, and so there was one way to be, and so you didn't think really much about anything else. So I really treasure my time obviously with my own child. Who I also want to mention is biracial, and I feel like we need to bring race also into this conversation, because when I think about the trans women of color who are being harmed and murdered, I mean, it's part of this bigger picture of safety and acceptance and all sorts of things. So anyway, but I love my time with LGBTQ plus kids, including my own.
You just reminded me, Alice, of so my kids are Black Latinos. I myself identify as a Black Latina. I'm a Black Latina. But this year during Pride Month, my daughter, my 11-year-old, came running out of the room and screaming in joy, like a joyful scream. Mom, did you know that? The how did she phrase it? She said something along the lines of like, do you know that the leader, like the first Pride, was initiated by a Black trans woman, and she was the one who threw the first brick, but she said it with such joy and pride, right? Like that sense of like, like one of my people did that. And that's how the Stonewall riot started. And it was such a, moment of joy and understanding and learning growth from her. And I think she learned it from TikTok or, something like that. So I think it's one of those spaces also that is beautiful, right? Like we can be like, oh, kids on TikTok, for instance, and just kind of like minimize it. But this is the kind of conversations that they are having, right, in those spaces, along with all the fun and silliness and everything else. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much. That is, yeah, no, it is. You're not the first person who's mentioned TikTok, and like it is, and that's even like a little bit past it's like the other half of my generation, but like it is pretty amazing, like a lot of the stuff that people are learning there, and I really love that story. I'm really glad that that your kid had that reaction and learned that and felt that way. I think that's really cool.
I remember when you said that on Facebook, and I was excited about it then. I'm still excited about it. Mm-hmm. I've been in 8 of these interviews now, and every time I hear a lot of the same stuff and a lot of new different stuff that really makes me think more. One of the things that came up for me listening to both of you respond to those first 2 questions about what do queer and trans youth need and what do they bring, is in part that they bring what you let them. That like what they need is to have the space that all kids need, the listening that all kids need to be themselves, to bring themselves. And especially thinking about parents of young kids, this isn't just what your kid needs if you already know that they're LGBTQ plus, right? Like this is what all kids need. And then the ones who will turn out to be LGBTQ plus can bring what they can bring because the space is open for them,
Right. I work, we're trained as therapists, right, to try to not get in the way of our clients, right? So when we're sitting with somebody, we bring our stuff into the room because it's there, because we're there, and our clients bring their stuff into the room because it's there, and that's why they're coming to see us. And so, I work really, really hard professionally to create a space that's as open as possible for any piece of a child's story to come into the room without me, you should be doing this, or you should do it this way, or these are my values, and so you need to adhere to my values. And I think kids don't have a lot of space like that. I think whether it's LGBTQ kids or kids in general, straight kids, that they are often they're told what's expected of them, and they are told how to be, and they're told what they should want. And it's not always true what we tell them, right? And we don't leave room for them to say things like, I want my hair this length, right? Or I don't want to go to college, or I want to do this job, not this job. And, it's the parents that I work with whom I really learn the most from are the parents who look at their children and are able, again, to recognize them as somebody that's different from them, and somebody who has their own likes and needs and struggles, and has feelings that run the gamut every single day, right? And so, I strive to be that as a parent. It's easier to be that professionally than it is to be as a parent. Just to add that in there.
Absolutely. Alice, you also reminded me earlier, you said something about there's like some fears that you might bring to parenting a kid from your own experience in a different place and time. And it made me think, like you just said, we often tell kids what's expected of them, and we also tell them what they can expect of us. And one thing that I've really enjoyed about interacting with queer and trans folks who are much younger than me is that they expect to be treated well. Like, they expect respect, some of them, ideally, when things are going well, right? And like, when I was just coming out the third time or whatever, when I was like 19, I think I was out as trans for like 5 or 6 years before even any of my teachers even tried to call me the right pronouns, right? And if I say that to a trans middle schooler or high schooler today, they're like, that's not reasonable, right? Like, grandma should be able to get it right the first try. And like, I do want them to respect people's learning curves. And also, yeah, that's kind of reasonable. She should be able to respect you the first try, right? Or at least the second try, and not 5 or 10 years later. And that sort of entitlement in a positive way, I think, to be treated with dignity in a way that, like, I mean, I'm not yet 40, and yet I'm old for a trans person, right? And like, as queer and trans elders, we like have not always had that expectation of the world. And it's really great modeling, watching kids who are like, yeah, I'm just going to tell them what I need and they're going to meet my needs.
Well, exactly. And so when our child came out, my wife, so I'll be 50 soon, and my wife is 57, and she was driving Jess around, and from the back seat of the car, Jess said, everything happens from the back seat of a car with kids, and Jess said, well, it's time for me to start wearing girl clothes now. And that was that. And, but Bonnie, my wife, came out as a lesbian when she was in middle school or high school in like the early-ish 80s. And then I came out in 91 at a women's college that was very welcoming and accepting and whatever. But we both still came out in a time, especially Bonnie, where the expectation was not, oh, everybody's going to get this right. The expectation was, okay, now how do I hide, right? Where do I go? Bonnie talks a lot about finding a lesbian bar. She was underage, but somebody directed her there because this was the place, and it was like secret. And and I came out and it was really angsty, and I walked around and thought about it a lot, and I thought a lot about what I would lose should I come out as a lesbian. And I thought, okay, this means that I will never get married. I will never have children. I will never have the life that I see most other people around me having. And so do I choose my identity, right? Or do I choose this false person and get married and have kids? And it was just from a time when options, doors slam shut, if you decided to come out as who you are. And so when Jess came out, Bonnie's fear for Jess's safety was like bigger than my fear for Jess's safety. And I think it's because like she would go to the lesbian bar and it was risky to go to the lesbian, right? So she has that almost in her DNA that this is a dangerous thing to do. And for a lot of people, it still is. And I want to just make that very, very clear, right? And so there are things that we need to fear for our biracial, non-binary child. Absolutely. But it's hard for those fears for us to separate those fears from the fears that we did both came out, during the AIDS crisis. And so we also have to remind ourselves that we're in a different time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You say that because I try, sometimes successfully, I'm sure many times not successfully, not to impose my fear or like act, from a fear standpoint. Like I said, I'm sure, and I do know that I fail many times miserably. But I have noticed and caught myself in those moments where I have worked really hard, and sometimes not so hard, just like really being very intentional and mindful and consciously raising my children in a certain way, right? To think of themselves in a certain way when it comes to the racial and ethnic identities that the children of immigrants. So also like sense of rootness and, the languages, all of those things, right? Like appreciate and love their skin color, their hair type, like all of those things, right? Around race and ethnicity. And also be understanding and acceptance of various sexualities and forms of expression and genders and all of that, right? So I've been very steady and intentional around that. And I have caught myself having those moments of like my kids expressing themselves in a way that I feel proud of, but also fearful of other people's reactions. So it's kind of like this, like, kind of like I hear them say, especially the older one, the younger one, I'm sure we're going to start pretty soon to say things where I'm like, yes, it's working, right? Like she's doing the things that I have been, wanting her to do or understand or open her mind to. And oh my goodness, how is this person going to react? So like one moment when this happened, when I was actually pregnant with my youngest child, we were having dinner with a good friend and her daughter. So it was like, the two of us and our two daughters, hanging out, just like at a, having ice cream or something like that. And my friend asked a question about the gender of the baby that I was carrying, which we chose not to find out the sex, not the gender, but we found out just to wait, until birth to find out and everything. So anyway, my friend asked my daughter, so do you want to have a brother or a sister, something along those lines? And she was like, I don't really care, and also there's no guarantees, She said something like that, and I knew where this was going, right? My friend was like, oh yeah, like because the ultrasound, they could be wrong. Like the doctor could be wrong and tell you that it's a boy and it's actually ends up being a girl. And she was like, no, the kid could be trans. So we could say that, oh, it's a girl at birth, but years later we found out it's actually a boy. So, I'm not really attached to any idea of having a brother or a sister. And she's saying that, and like I said, in the moment, I'm feeling proud. Like, wow, this is my kid, right? Like, this is my. At that point, she was 9, around there, and I'm like, yeah, this is my 9-year-old. Yes. And at the same time, I'm like, oh God, how is my friend gonna take this? What is she gonna think about me, right? Like, I'm being very honest. What is gonna think about me, and like, what kind of conversation to have with my kid? So I just kind of like took a step back and waited, and like, one of those moments, and my friend was kind of like, oh, right, you're right. And then like, okay, moving on to the next topic. But I did notice that about myself. Like, I had that moment of like, so it's interesting, right? Like, even when you do things, or at least for me, doing things from a consciousness and with purpose and intention, still having to do that internal work of getting rid of, internalized transphobia, internalized homophobia, and the fears of how the people are going to perceive me and my children. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that there's a level of when your children don't, I mean, maybe even when they do fit into the privilege box, right? So they're cis, white, Christian, they fit in their male, that when they don't fit into that box, there's a hypervigilance of, are they going to be okay? It's like a constant sort of looking around. I remember hearing a parent talk about having gone to the Philly trans conference and being in a room filled with parents of trans kids and feeling more relaxed than they had felt in a very, very long time. And this parent looked around and realized that they didn't have to worry about the people in the room harming their child, right? And it was one of the first times since their child had come out as trans that their shoulders were able to like drop below their ears, and they were able to take a deep breath because they knew in those precious minutes that everything, like, all right, we're all okay here. But it's like parenting is a balance between like joy and terror all the time, right? So it's quite a journey that no one can. I thought I was prepared because I had worked with kids, but I wasn't. But the hypervigilance is exhausting. Okay, so our child's going to go to this camp, for instance, right? And okay, where's our child going to go to the bathroom? Where's our child going to change into a bathing suit? The bathing suit, so if my child wears this kind of bathing suit, then my child's genitalia is going to be obvious, which will then out her in this way. And are we worried about that more than she actually is? Maybe. Cabins for overnights. Okay, there's the girls' I mean, the world is so binary that it's like this constant feeling of having to be 20 steps ahead of our child and what she might then go do, right? We're in a restaurant. Okay, let's check out the bathroom situation, right? Or let's check what is clothing shopping, right? Clothing stores have gotten, in my lifetime, more binary than I remember them being in the 70s and 80s. I don't know what has happened, but that the body my child has fits into this kind of clothing, but that's not the kind of clothing that she wants to wear. And it's this kind of clothing, which is cut in this other way that doesn't quite fit. And so, but she refuses to get clothing from this part of it, even if it's androgynous clothing, right? And so there's all of this hypervigilance around things that I think parents who have cis kids take for granted. Like, we're just going to go into the store and get some clothes. And we go into the store and it's a big deal. Bathing suit shopping for your kids. It's just a bathing suit, right? But it's not just a bathing suit. It becomes this event for the summer. Like, what is this summer going to look like in terms of bathing suits? So there's a lot of anxiety that comes with, I think, being a parent of any child that doesn't fit completely into that box around safety and acceptance.
So I did want to ask, and I think that you both have talked a little bit about this, but my next question was, what would you say to well-meaning adults in the community who are new to thinking about gender and sexuality and who aren't sure what to do or say?
I think, because it's going to sound really basic, but really try to educate yourself as much as you can. And I think one of the beautiful things about living in the way that we're living right now in this country in particular, and again, this is an overgeneralization, but most people have access to information, right? Like through the phone, like Google stuff, there are videos, social media. Not everything is reliable or a good source, but the information is there and you can weave, certain things and like weed it out and reach out. There are some people who are very open and happy to share perspective and share resources. There are YouTube videos, that there's so many ways in which we can access information, at least some basic information. Which, of course, that requires time. But as a first step, my recommendation would be to listen, because doing the research may take some time. But if you are working with a young person in your job, you're a teacher or in a program, or it's your own child or a neighbor, and they come to tell you something, the best thing you can do in the moment is listen. And if you feel like you don't have the answers because they're asking you a question or looking for advice, let them know that, like, I'm trying to figure some things out, and I do want to support you. I want to be here for you, and I feel like I need to learn more. But at least remain open to the possibility of being a support system and to learning and growing. And I'm not gonna lie, like sometimes it does feel overwhelming, particularly if you are encountering something that you have never encountered before. Like if you've never really met anybody who is openly non-binary, and you never really had to think about what pronouns to use before in all the way that it's in a very binary heteronormative system. It can get overwhelming. It can be confusing. It can be even scary, or you might be like, what are you saying? I don't understand what you're saying. It's okay to feel that way and acknowledge it to yourself. And I think that even with that, just take a deep breath. Sometimes bite your tongue. I do think it's important sometimes to bite our tongue and listen and remain open.
I think for those who are new to it, to remember that they're new to it, and that there's not one person who's an expert on humans, right? So some people might declare themselves experts on humans, but I don't believe that there's any one expert on humans, and that just to believe people when you hear like if you're going to come to me and ask me what it feels like to be a queer mom of a queer kid, just believe what I say, right? Don't say, well, that can't be because that's not the way I grew up, so you can't have that experience, right? That I think, and in the same way, don't necessarily think that I speak for all queer parents of queer kids either. So both believe me, but also know that the queer mom next to me is going to have a completely different experience. And so I think our defenses come into play, right? When we hear something that we're not familiar with, right? And we're like, well, my experience is this, so that must be true. But I think believing somebody and their experiences and their feelings goes a long way.
Thank you both. So I did want to ask about representations in media, if that's something that you're familiar with. If not, it's okay. But my first question was, where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in TV or film?
I mean, certainly out of my wheel of expertise, but I do want to say that there's more presence now, certainly than when I was growing up in Venezuela, you know. And certainly it's a different country, but the United States being the United States and the, you know, superpower, we got a lot of important media, like Hollywood movies and, you know, sitcoms and all of that stuff. Besides of obviously our local, you know, TV shows and programming and all of that. So I don't remember growing up with any LGBTQ representation or in the media, or any like journalist who was out, or, you know, anything like that. If anything, was a very flamboyant, very like a caricature gay BFF, you know, in a soap opera kind of character, if anything. So anyway, that's my point of comparison. I wanted to point that out. So when I fast forward to 2020, there's definitely more presence in shows and I mean, talk about social media, for instance, right? There are some really great examples and language and people and influencers, you know, all of that. So one show that I watched with my daughter more recently, I don't know if this is like the best representation, but I certainly was excited to see, and I thought that they did a decent job. And this is from a straight perspective, so other folks might be like, not really, was the Netflix Babysitters Club, for instance. I thought that they did a decent job at bringing up not only around gender and sexuality, but just like what young people may be experiencing around friendships and, you know, family issues and everything. So that might not be the specific great answer, but I do see that there's a more effort to bring out characters who either identify as LGBTQ or having conversations, or just bring out folks like actors, professionals who have, you know, a media presence that are out and that can be open about it.
Thank you.
We don't watch a ton of television. Like my wife and I are starting to watch Pose, which is fun, you know. Pose is Pose. I think it was a huge deal whenever Ellen, however many years ago, Ellen came out and said, I'm gay. I mean, that was like we were all crowded around our television sets because this was like the biggest thing we had ever seen in our lives and assumed like it had never happened before and it'll never happen again. So we need to, you know, VCR this, you know, like, you know, my child loves Queer Eye and Modern Family, but again, it's sort of more of a stereotypical sort of caricature of gay men. You know, we always point out to our child, like, we watch Rachel Maddow, Mayor Pete, you know. So there are people in the sort of where we're pointing it out more, I think, is in politics and on the news now than we are in, I would love to see someday a show in which the gender identification or the sexual orientation of the people in the show weren't the brunt of that wasn't the focus of them, that they were just regular people doing their thing, and they were still funny, but not because they're a gay man, right? They're funny because they're just a funny person, right? Or a lesbian couple that there's lots of drama, but not because they're lesbians, right? It's because there's lots of drama, and that's the show. So, but we're not big TV watchers, so I can't comment necessarily more than that.
All right, thank you both. And then I also wanted to ask, in terms of media, where you see positive representations of queer and trans people in books for kids and youth.
I don't have a specific, I'm not, it's out of my wheel of expertise, but I do tell you this, a little anecdote. I recently quarantined and going back to school is going to be remotely for my child. So I took her to a bookstore and I said, just pick whatever you want. Like, I'll buy you any book you want. I just want to see you reading something that is different from just being in front of the iPad, right? So anything. And she picked like 4 or 5 books, and I think about 3 of those were young adults, like with a queer LGBTQ theme. Now, I haven't read them. She's reading them right now, but I was happy that they were there in a Barnes and Noble. Like, it wasn't, I didn't go to like the radical lefty, bookstore. It was just regular Barnes and Nobles in the, young adult section. And she looked at them, she looked at the cover, she read the back. She did her own thing. I just left her alone for a while, and she picked, and she's like, these are the ones I want. And I was happy to see that, like I said, about half of them had some kind of queer identified character or the theme or something. So I also took that as a positive, move towards more, at least, openness and exposure and availability of stories.
I think books are doing a better job than TV. And Jess has really been into Raina Telgemeier graphic novels, the names of which are escaping me right now, but they happen to have queer kids in them. So the queer kids, that's not the focus of the book, but these preteen teens happen to be queer in them. And I wrote down just a few books that were helpful to us when our child was in first grade and coming out. And one is I Am Jazz, which is based on Jazz Jennings. Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity, and Meet Polka Dot. So those 3 books were really helpful to our child and also our child's peers during that time of coming out.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I have heard of a couple of those books. I think it's really good that that's sort of becoming more popular and more available. Like, Romina, what you said about the Barnes and Noble, like, I don't really remember that happening as much when I was little, but now, like, even outside of any particular section, you can find books that have queer and trans characters, and we do still have a long way to go for, good representation, but there are things happening that are really exciting, and there are things being written and filmed and made that are really exciting.
When I was in college, in the late 80s and early 90s, I was in a psychology class, and a student and I together were assigned to do some paper, and we chose the topic of gay and lesbian parents. and back then, I mean, like, nobody had those, right? Like, nobody had gay and lesbian parents. And so we looked around for books, like, what could we find? And we ended up going into Boston to this bookstore that was like, it didn't have a name on it, and it was sort of down this alley, and like people would go in and that literally they would put your books in nondescript brown paper bags so that you could like carry them out of there. And so there was this air of, not even an air of, it was purely secret that you were going to like find this illicit information in a back alley in Boston, you know. So it's really great to then go into Barnes and Noble and have a different experience now.
That is really great. Yeah, that it's changed from that in a lot of places. So another question I had is, what do you wish you had learned as a kid or youth about gender and sexuality that you didn't learn until later?
Everything. I grew up in a very Catholic, country, not even family, like country. So very, and everything that comes with that, right? Heteronormativity, binary, all of that. But I think if I had to pick like one thing is to, at the very least, know that there is so much human variation, that there's just so much diversity, like there's so much, there's X number of like ways of being sexually, X number of ways of being in gender, and feeling and being and interacting. And yeah, so at the very least, just the understanding that the world and the human experience is much wider than what I was, taught from since I was born.
I mean, I would say virtually the same thing. And I think it's a generational thing. And I think also, sort of referring back to what I said earlier, was that coming out doesn't mean you have to lose things that you thought were once possible. That there's a community waiting for you, right? Ideally, there's a community waiting for you when you come out, and people who have been there, people who understand, and also people who know what's possible. And so when I was growing up, it just wasn't an option. And so again, I thought that I would have to give everything up in order to be who I wanted to be. And when I was coming out of the closet, the person I fell in love with, my best friend, said, what are your goals for when you're, I hadn't come out yet. And I said, well, I want to have a job in this, and then I want to get married and have kids. And she looked at me and she said, oh, I don't think you're ever going to get married. And that was true then, right? That we were giving things up. And so I would want kids to know that they don't have to give things up necessarily, that they can still have a family, have good work, have things that they love and treasure, and be who they are.
Thank you. Those are really good answers. I mean, we've had a lot of people who say, everything, like there's so many things that people didn't learn, but it is also really nice to hear like specific things. And I think that's really important to acknowledge what we wish we've learned and then think about how we can make spaces for people to learn those things now, however old they are. So this is one of the questions. Now we're kind of getting into the questions that are less general, but I think this one would be a really good question for y'all, since you're both parents and you both work with kids in different capacities. So as you know, one challenge with this work is that some people are fine with talking about LGBTQ teens, but they feel it's not appropriate or it's not important to talk about gender or sexuality with younger kids. What would you say to them?
I completely disagree based on my own experience as a parent. I mean, I can talk about it as a professional as well, but as as an educator. But as a parent, I completely disagree. I started with my now 11-year-old since she was born, just even the way I talk to her. And I consider it a safety issue. So it wasn't even a notion of like, wanting to raise, my kid to speak in a certain way. For me, it was a safety issue. Like I felt like I needed to be open and clear and straightforward about anything from like anatomy, naming things, to what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, boundaries. Her dad actually thought that I was exaggerating because she was a tiny baby, and I would talk to her in a certain way about like her body parts and what was acceptable, and I would ask for like a consent, like I'm gonna change your diaper and I'm gonna clean you, like that level, and I would say things like. I'm touching you because I need to clean you, but I respect you. Like I started with those things, but it's not okay for other people to do this. And he thought I was exaggerating, but that's how I started. To me, it's all part of the same conversation, right? Like having conversations around boundaries and respect and sexuality, sexual expression, identity, gender, like all of that. To me, it's like all part of the same conversation. So, like I said, I started thinking about it as a safety issue, and then the other piece for me, because I studied social justice education as a straight person, that's part of my personal commitment. Is to be respectful and honor and acknowledge LGBTQ experiences and realities, and also dismantle, this heteronormative system that we all live in. Part of what I see as my contribution is raise kids differently from the way that I was raised, right? My children. So using certain language, talking about pronouns. I have another funny story with my 11-year-old. When she was about 6 years old, I was calling her out a little bit because I thought she had been rude with this person who had come into the house and was trying to talk to her. And I, after the person left, I asked her, like, what do we do when we meet somebody for the first time? And really the question, what I wanted her to say was like, hello, nice to meet you, my name is, right? And her answer was, my pronouns. And kind of got a chuckle. I was like, yeah, you should tell them your pronouns. But also, what parents can think, right? Like, hello, nice to meet you. Look at them in the eye, shake their hand, whatever, So that's how I it's never too early. In fact, I found it really extremely easy because we got so used to having that conversation. So now that she's in the preteen years and really exploring and thinking about her own sexuality and gender in more really profound ways that make more sense to her, thinking about like dating and we have those kind of conversations. It's normalized. It's not, we don't have to have like the talk. It's not the same awkwardness that I hear that other parents have because we started since she was a little tiny baby. So for me, it was a lot of me practicing also how to dismantle a lot of the taboos that I had in my head about talking about things like sex and sexuality. And now that she's at that age, feels less awkward to me to do that.
Romina, I found myself wanting you to write a parenting book. Please write a parenting book. That was just fabulous. I think that the things that we as parents don't talk to our kids about, they're going to get that information from somewhere, right? And so you have to end up deciding, okay, do I want my kid to learn this stuff from me, or do I want my kid to learn this stuff from Johnny in her first grade class, right? Like, and truly, do I want to be able to provide my child with accurate information, particularly about consent, which I think should be taught from as early as possible. And so, I think a lot of people think that talking about gender identity or sexual orientation to young kids means that you're talking about intercourse, right? And it's not. It's not. So people shy away from it somehow, that kids are too young to know that two women might be married, in the same way that they already know that a woman and a man are married, right? They see it on TV all the time, right? And so, but that somehow, that when we are talking about people who are other, that it becomes sexualized, which, no, I'm not going to talk about intercourse with a 3-year-old, right? But that's not what, it's like the two things sort of layer on top of one another and get all tangled up somehow. And, in my professional world, I see this a lot about death, that people, they're like, well, we're not going to tell Susie that her grandmother died because we don't want to, and I'm like, yes, but her grandmother died. Like we need to tell Susie her grandmother died, right? And well, I don't want to scar my child, and I can't even think of a time when it didn't go in an okay way. Like, we tell Susie her grandmother died and she's sad, but she actually does better than the grownups around her. And so, by not talking about these things with younger children, we make these things taboo and sort of mysterious. And so there's stories made up about them. And no, we can't talk about that. I mean, I think the one place I struggle is that when people send their kids to me for therapy, and the child will say, Alice, what's your husband like? Right? And then in that moment, I need to decide, do I come out to that child? What's their family like? Are they going to pull that child from me because then suddenly I am dangerous or something? And does that have to do more with me than it does with them? Like, all of these questions come up. And so I think in that way, I am paused most often in my mind, because I'm like, okay, do I tell when my clients ask about my child? Some of my clients saw me pregnant, right? And so then what do I do about my child's pronouns? And really, my child's pronouns are not why their child is in therapy, right? So then what do I do? And do I remain closeted about my child? Is that fair to my child? Is that fair to this child? So it becomes this like messy web of constantly coming out. And am I coming out on behalf of my child? And is that what she wants? And so it's complicated.
Alice, I so appreciate that last piece that you brought up, particularly in terms of small communities and rural communities. And my mom is a therapist, and sometimes I go home to the very, very small community I grew up in and like do a training there, or just go home for a holiday or whatever. And my last name is unusual. So I, like, anybody I introduce myself to, they're either going to be like, oh, your dad worked on my house one time, or, oh, your mom used to be my therapist, right? It's like pretty inevitable. And so my parents and I are kind of always deciding whether or not to out each other in those ways, because if then someone's going to be like, I didn't know Margaret had a son, right? And then depending how that conversation goes, now my mom's going to be in an awkward conversation next week. And so just, I think the whole idea of privacy and disclosure gets so different when you're in a really small community like that. And it's absurd to think that like a toddler in that community would not know, because everybody knows everything about each other, you know?
Also, I did want to ask, since you have already brought it up at this point, both in terms of your kids and kids you work with, and really any kids, how do you support, how would you support queer youth who may not be out to their parents?
That's a tricky one. I actually ran into a situation recently with one of my kids' friends. Was having a hard time. You know, I think it's probably hard at any point. And right now with the COVID-19 and having to be home so much, it's probably really challenging. Well, I would say probably. I think it is challenging. It is challenging for many young people in general, and definitely for queer youth who are not out to their parents. And there was this one particular friend of my daughter that decided to come out to her mom, and the mom was not accepting it, and was, well, beyond brokenhearted, right? It was also scared and crying, you know, you can imagine, and reached out to my daughter. So my daughter, you know, came to me like, you know, we need to help this person because she's not, you know, she's having a hard time. And I'm like, in that moment when I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? I don't even know these folks. Like, they are not friends of mine that I could just like call and say hi and, you know, try to do a little intervention, or at least, you know, nothing. I know the kid superficially, but that's as far as I go in terms of relationships. So what I did, I probably do what many people do. I actually went to my social media and made a post like, does anybody have any resources to support a person who's going through this situation? And I did get some very thoughtful resources in terms of, have you thought of this, have you thought of that? There's this organization, there is this app, there is this. So what I did is I gave my child that so she could pass it on to this other kid. And I, in all honesty, I don't know how this. I do know she seems to be okay right now, but I don't know how the story ends in terms of the resources. I don't know if she used them or not. But at the very least, which I hope that it was helpful. I don't know, that she knows that she had people rooting for her outside of that immediate circle. And this is something that I did tell my daughter, to let her know that we were there for her if it became more of an emergency, like if she needed to leave home or something like that. We are in the same neighborhood, so she could always, come to our house. So that's a more recent, concrete experience that I've had.
There's a small cluster of things that can help determine for somebody who is not being treated well where they live. There's a small cluster of things that can indicate that they're going to go on and be okay later. And one of those things is one person who loves and believes in you. So it doesn't have to be tons and tons of people. It can be one person who knows you and who looks at you and accepts you and believes you. And so I go into a lot of so I'm going to answer sort of professionally now because we've accepted our child. And but I very much believe that it is that person's prerogative to come out to whom they want, when they want, and when they feel they are safe to do so. And I assume, as I did with myself sort of growing up, that I knew my family system better than anybody from the outside of me, right? And so when kids come to me, I assume that in some way they know their family system much better than I do, and that they have survived to this point, right? They have done what they've needed to do to make it to age 12, age 13, 15, 17, whatever. And so when it's all said and done, I really try to position myself so that I could be that one person, if that's what they need me to be, who accepts them and loves them for who they are. And if they then decide that they want to come out to their parents, or their parents are not, accepting of them, I will try to maneuver with them, sort of with the child sort of in the lead as much as possible. I do have to say, I do have to admit that I struggle sometimes as a therapist and as a mother of a queer child and queer myself when I hear parents, like my heart starts to beat really fast if they're like, no, this isn't natural, and this isn't, my kid won't be this way, and and so it's hard for me sometimes to manage my own emotions in those situations, because it's so close to home that I have to work really hard to then help that child navigate those parents. Because I just want to shout and say, just love your kid, like just love your kid, right? And I can't do that in that way, shouting in that way, in the therapy space. But really, I make space in my office for the children to be whomever they are, and in play or in talking or in writing or in painting or whatever. And I have things in my office like rainbow stickers and trans folks are welcome here. And so parents, at least if they're paying attention and looking around my office, they can sort of begin to understand where I'm coming from, if they haven't picked up on other cues.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I do want to ask one more parenting specific question, and then we'll talk about a couple other topics. But
before we do that, Claire, I just want to do a quick time check, because we didn't plan to go this long.
because it's 2 people interviewing how long one was supposed to end up being.
Yeah, so we got into a lot more conversation than we were expecting.
Yeah, I don't have anywhere to be. Who has somewhere to be?
I do.
Okay, no, it's totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can do the next, Romy, do you have to leave right this second, or like 10 minutes or something?
10 minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's talk about intersectionality, because that's the part we haven't gotten to at all. And that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my first question on that topic is, what particular barriers do queer and trans youth of color face, and what particular strengths and assets do they bring? And what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for queer and trans youth of color?
Well, one of the things I know from, personally have witnessed, heard, being like I mentioned earlier, I'm a Black Latina, so that's my community. I'm an immigrant. I'm from Venezuela originally. And one thing that I've heard, and again, this is a general statement, obviously not every single person in my communities, the various ones that I belong to, feel that way. But one thing that I it's not rare to hear is that being queer, being lesbian, bisexual, trans, any of the labels or experiences, it's a white thing, right? And being from outside of the United States, in some cases I hear, oh, that's an American thing. Like that's not who we are. That doesn't belong to us. That's like imported, in some ways. So I know that's one of the issues, like in some of my communities and some of my people, that it's a struggle and an area where some of us need to learn and educate ourselves more in terms of understanding that being queer doesn't really belong to a particular race, or that it's I know that's one that definitely we need some more work and support with.
The more pieces of somebody's identity that intersect, the harder it is, or the rarer it is, the more rarer it is to find people in curriculum in the community that then mirror that person. So right, so like, let's say my child were just Latina, right, and we're cisgender, right? We could find people that could show her, okay, this is what kind of grown up you can be, right? And maybe in school one might be mentioned, right? Like we don't do a great job in schools, right? Like let's just put that out there. Like it's very white. The history is very white. The suffering of people who aren't white is not taught still. And so for my brown, trans, non-binary child to ever in a public school see herself represented in somebody that they are studying, or in a teacher, or in a principal, like I would be shocked. And I happily shocked, thrilled, joyful, but I feel like the more places of other that intersect means the fewer people you're going to see, that my child is going to see, who look like her, sound like her, think about things like her. And so I think it's up to teachers, administrators, school personnel to really search, to really look for examples that look and sound and think like the kids that are in their class. And so if they have Black kids in their class, there needs to be examples there needs to be Black history, like regardless of who's in the class, right? But especially for these kids to see themselves like this hero, right? So there's lots of white heroes, quote unquote, that are taught in school, right? But like, what about all the other heroes, and what about all the other people who just look like you and are brave like you? And it saddens me when adults don't search, and they take what's sort of been handed to them from times before, and we're going to talk about George Washington again, right? Like we're going to talk about this guy, this white guy who did these great things, and then he went to the moon and he walked around, right? But we're not going to talk about people who look like you. And so then how do kids put themselves in the future? It's no wonder why kids have foreshortened ideas of their future when they can't see that there's a place to go, right? So anyway, that's my thought about intersectionality, and I think about it a lot with our child. And even teaching intersectionality, like where's that happening? I don't know. It's happening in homes. I don't know if it's happening in schools, right?
I think of I think of my own experience. I said that I'm heterosexual and I'm not a young person, but thinking about my own intersecting identities, and I think of Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a lesbian, Chicana, Mexican American, and who grew up by the U.S.-Mexico border, and she would use that imagery of the border as a sometimes that's literally like being by the border, right, U.S.-Mexico border, and sometimes really metaphorically of living in between, crossing, and also living like in a third space of sorts. and she would talk about how she wasn't really fully accepted or fully embraced in, queer communities because they were too white, and she was, a Chicana, Mexican American, how she, with her own, ethnic, racial communities, right? All the Chicanos, Mexican Americans, Mexicans, wasn't all either fully accepted because she was an out, lesbian, and even the language, she said she felt most comfortable speaking Spanglish, which is a mix of two languages, right? So I think about that as an asset, even though many people may think about it as a limitation. And yes, there are complexities and certainly things that can be painful about living in those, with those experiences, not being fully accepted in any place, or the places where you want to be accepted. But that also creates an openness and a sensitivity and a view of the world that is less constrained, right, by those binaries and those really rigid boundaries that really impact us all negatively, in my opinion. So it helps people see beyond those boundaries, understand the world in a more open way, be more accepting of differences and other people, because you're able to recognize, the struggle and the joy and the beauty and the silliness and the jokes, that come with it, of seeing the world from this complete different perspective. That is not one thing or another. So I know I personally experienced that in my intersecting identities as an immigrant. Like a feeling like I don't really fully belong to Venezuela, but I don't really belong fully to the United States. The way I speak, even my first language nowadays, the way I speak it sounds weird to, other Venezuelans who have never left Venezuela. So I think of the same way when I think about queer youth of color and their assets and what they can bring, like living in this intersecting space of understanding the world from a much broader perspective, and the way they see other people and understand and create it comes from a richer, more profound perspective that if they had just like this singular one experience.
Thank you very much for that.
I think they show us the beauty of humanness, right? Like, it's not, I don't know, it's just this, it's so sort of gross that we've like shrunken humanness to this one way of being somehow in this country. Like it's and queer kids of color, I think they sort of push that open, right? And they show us what's wonderful about being human, and that is that there are so many differences between us and so many different perspectives, and it's not just this sliver of humanity that somehow we've celebrated here in this country.
Thank you. Do you have time for another question, Romina, or do you need to go?
I need to go. Let's do something very quick.
Okay.
I totally get it. I think it's fine, and I will fill you in on all of the logistical wrap-up stuff later. And thank you so much for being here. It has been really great talking with you.
Thank you so much. It was amazing to meet you. I agree with Alice. You should write a parenting book. So.
One of these days. And thank you. That really means a lot to me. Thank you.
All right.
So great seeing you all and meeting you both, Alice and Claire. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Alice, do you have time for one more question?
Okay. So if this is, I don't know if this is something that you have insight on, but this is another question that we had about intersectionality, which was, what particular barriers do disabled and or neurodivergent LGBTQ people face? And what particular strengths and assets do they bring? And what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for these youth?
So neurodivergent and what?
And disabled.
Barriers. Gosh, there's so many of them. There's so many of them. I think it is similar to how I was describing intersectionality, that we have done the same thing with people's brains and bodies, that there's one way of being, and that there is one way of interacting socially that's appropriate, right? That we have all of these rules about you have to make eye contact and you have to say these things and you have to do, and we make these rules without taking into account that people are different. And a number of the LGBTQ kids I work with are neurodivergent, and are wonderful and delightful, and again, help my brain expand beyond what I've been taught for 49 years. And so I think the barriers for those kids are people who are so rigidly attached to one way of doing things or one way of seeing things that they create environments that are not accessible to these kids, right? Because they're not thinking beyond themselves. And so it has made me question, working with kids who are neurodivergent has made me question a lot of everything around interactions with people and ways of communicating and ways we send messages, whether it's overt or subtle, or because maybe that way isn't the way that it should be, right? So can you repeat the question again?
I mean, you already talked about the barrier, so I may just go with the other parts. What particular strengths and assets do they bring, and what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for these youth?
When I give trainings to people about kids in general, and what I do constantly when I'm working with kids is I'm constantly trying to think about what I know about the children and put myself as much as I possibly can in the shoes of that child, as much as I can, while still recognizing my own privilege and my own access and my own everything. And so, for instance, I say, so parents often want to put kids on behavior plans, teachers too. They want to put them on behavior plans and like give them prizes for doing certain things in certain ways, right? And so lots of times teachers and parents ask me about behavior plans and like, let's create one. And what they want to fix is not necessarily something that's in control of by the child, right? And so I say to them, okay, parent, so let's pretend that I put you on a behavior plan and where I followed you around all day and I put a smiley face or a frowny face in a box based on you doing advanced quantum physics, assuming that they're not a quantum physicist, all day long. And when you are not successful doing the thing that we're trying to, you're trying to earn a reward for, like $1 million, right? $1 million. And they're like, well, of course I would stop trying because I can't do quantum physics. Is that even a thing? Quantum physics, right? Like, so I can't do that. So why would I try, right? And so I'm constantly trying to bring parents to the experience that I think their child is having. Like, okay, your child doesn't function in that way, but you're rewarding them for trying to function in a way that they can't do, right? And so I would want adults to constantly be thinking about, if I were in the shoes of this child and had the skills of this child, and then somebody was trying to follow me around and make it so that I acted in a certain way, or I had to access parts of my brain that actually weren't online. Like, that's not the way that my brain works. I wish that grownups would spend more time thinking about their own experiences of frustration and failure and periods of low self-esteem when they felt like they couldn't do something, right? And when they're able to do that, they are much more empathic towards people who learn differently, who behave differently, who interact socially differently, when they can remember what it feels like to not have the skill that's being asked for.
I am actually autistic myself, so I think that was our community, like I'm in the advocacy community, we talk a lot about stuff like behavior plans and how that's like not a great thing. So, and I think I liked your analogy because I'm kind of thinking of that in the way that, like, yeah, I mean, we could do that, like have a bunch of people follow like an allistic person, which is a term for not autistic. I don't know. Everybody watching probably is not going to know that. But a person around and like reward them with stickers for not making eye contact because it makes us feel uncomfortable. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And it's not harming us to be different. Like, I mean, you don't really need to, there are certain skills that are like good to acquire in ways that are more productive. And there are other things that are just, this is how I communicate and this is how you communicate, and that's okay.
Well, and we do this with kids who are queer all the time, right? Kids who we suspect are not cisgender, right? So there's a suspicion there, like, well, I'm not going to let this little boy wear a pink shirt because if we just put this into place, everything's going to be fine, right? If we make this kid play football, right, somehow everything's going to be fine. And so if we follow this kid around and make sure they're making eye contact at every time they need to be, right, everything's going to be fine, right? And what everything's going to be fine means is that they then fit into the box of privilege, right? They fit into the box of like straight, cis, blah, 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 blah. And we just can't, I mean, behavior plans have their place, don't get me wrong. So if there are therapists watching or behaviorists watching, like, I know behavior plans have their place and I get it, and human behavior and all of that. But a lot of times with regard to neurodivergence or disabilities, learning styles, sexual orientation, gender identity, we try to control these in this really sort of weird external sort of way. If we do this, then they won't be human in this way. It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous when I say it out loud, right? But we do it all the time.
It was really great. I really loved your answer here. I really like your whole interview was really great. And it was great to meet you. I think this whole interview worked really well, like with you and Romina. It felt like a conversation.
Alice, this was great. Thank you so much. And I know we went way over time and you've been so generous.